In the orderly proceedings of Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio has established certain expectations about who appears before his bench and under what circumstances. Adult defendants facing traffic violations, business owners dealing with licensing issues, property owners addressing code violations. These were the typical cases that filled his docket. But on this crisp morning in early December, someone would enter his courtroom who had never been there before, someone whose very presence would challenge every assumption about justice, responsibility, and the desperate measures that love can drive us to take. The case called to the bench was unusual from the very beginning. The citation listed the defendant as Emma Rodriguez, minor, with an accompanying note that a parent or guardian was required to be present for the proceedings. The charge was operating an unlicensed food cart in a public park without proper vendor permits, a violation that typically involved adult entrepreneurs trying to make a living outside the formal regulatory system. But as Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork, what he saw approaching the defendant's stand was not the adult vendor he expected, but a girl who appeared to be no more than 14 or 15 years old. Emma Rodriguez was small for her age, with long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing clothes that were clean but clearly well worn, a simple blue sweater that had been mended at the elbow, dark jeans that showed signs of having been hemmed and re-hemmed as she grew, and sneakers that had seen better days but had been carefully cleaned for this court appearance. But what truly distinguished Emma was her expression, not the defiant scowl or nervous fear that many young defendants displayed, but rather a quiet determination mixed with what appeared to be profound exhaustion, as if she had been carrying burdens far too heavy for her young shoulders. Walking beside Emma was a woman in her late 30s who moved with difficulty, using a cane for support and moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. The woman was Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, and even from a distance, Judge Caprio could see the worry and guilt written across her face, the expression of a parent who understood that her child was facing legal consequences but wasn't entirely sure why or how to protect her. The citation detailed multiple violations over the past 2 months, 6 separate instances where Emma had been observed selling homemade food items from a small cart in Roger Williams Park without the required business license, health permits, or vendor authorization. Each violation carried a fine of $150, totaling $900 in penalties that would be devastating for a family that was clearly struggling financially. The citations also noted that park rangers had warned Emma on multiple occasions that she needed proper permits, but that she had continued her unpermitted vending despite those warnings. As Emma and her mother approached the defendant's stand, Judge Caprio immediately noticed the way Emma positioned herself slightly in front of her mother, as if instinctively trying to shield the older woman from scrutiny or judgment. It was a protective stance that seemed to reverse the normal parent-child dynamic, suggesting that Emma had taken on responsibilities beyond what should be expected of someone her age. "Good morning," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying none of the stern authority that some judges used when addressing juvenile defendants. "I see we have Emma Rodriguez here regarding citations for operating without permits in Roger Williams Park. Before we discuss the specific violations, can someone help me understand what's going on here? Emma, are you really the person who was operating this food cart?" Emma straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Judge Caprio with a kind of honest, unwavering gaze that immediately conveyed both respect for authority and absolute certainty about her own actions. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm the one who was selling food in the park. My mother didn't know I was doing it at first, and when she found out, she told me to stop. But I couldn't stop, even after the rangers warned me, because I had to keep doing it." The phrase, "I had to keep doing it," immediately caught Judge Caprio's attention, suggesting that Emma's illegal vending wasn't motivated by teenage rebellion or a desire to make spending money, but by some compelling need that had driven her to continue despite warnings and the threat of legal consequences. The judge leaned forward in his chair, his experienced instincts telling him that this case would require careful listening and deep understanding. "Emma, when you say you had to keep selling food, what do you mean by that?" Judge Caprio asked, his tone inviting explanation rather than demanding justification. "Can you help me understand what circumstances led a young person like yourself to start a food vending business without permits?" Emma glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly despite the tears forming in her eyes. It was clear that whatever Emma was about to explain would be difficult for both of them, touching on circumstances that the family had probably been trying to keep private. Emma took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what was clearly going to be a challenging explanation. "Your Honor, I need to tell you about my family's situation so you'll understand why I did what I did," Emma began, her words revealing a level of thoughtfulness and context awareness that was impressive for someone her age. "My mother has multiple sclerosis, which is a disease that attacks the nervous system and makes it hard for her to work. She used to work as a nursing assistant, but about 2 years ago, her symptoms got so bad that she couldn't continue working." Judge Caprio felt an immediate surge of compassion as Emma described her mother's disability. Multiple sclerosis was a devastating disease that could rob people of their ability to work and support themselves, creating exactly the kind of financial crisis that pushed families to the edge of survival. The judge glanced at Maria Rodriguez, seeing the shame and pain in her expression as her daughter revealed their family's vulnerabilities in this public setting. "After my mom had to stop working, everything got really hard for our family," Emma continued, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had been forced to become an expert in her family's financial struggles. "We lost our apartment because we couldn't afford the rent anymore, and we had to move in with my Aunt Lucia and her family. 6 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment that was only supposed to have 3 people." The crowded living conditions that Emma described added another layer of stress to what was clearly an already overwhelming situation. Judge Caprio could imagine the challenges of multiple families sharing limited space, the loss of privacy and autonomy that came with depending on relatives for housing, and the psychological impact on a teenager trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while dealing with her mother's illness and their financial crisis. "My mom gets disability benefits now, but it's only $640 a month," Emma explained, revealing the brutal financial mathematics of their situation. "That's supposed to cover her medications, her share of rent to my aunt, food for both of us, and everything else we need. It's not nearly enough, even with my aunt trying to help us." Judge Caprio was struck by Emma's sophisticated understanding of her family's finances and her clear awareness of the inadequacy of disability benefits to meet basic needs. This was a young person who had been forced to think like an adult about survival, budgeting, and the impossible choices that poverty creates. "I'm 14 years old, so I can't get a regular job," Emma continued, bringing her narrative to the circumstances that had led to her illegal vending. "But I'm good at cooking. My abuela taught me before she died, and I thought maybe I could make food and sell it to help my mom with our expenses." The resourcefulness that Emma had shown in identifying a way to contribute to her family's income despite her age and the legal restrictions on child labor was remarkable. Judge Caprio could see that this teenager had approached her family's financial crisis with creativity and determination, using skills passed down from her grandmother to try to address needs that no child should have to worry about. "That's why I started selling food in the park," Emma said, finally connecting her explanation to the citations that had brought her to court. "I didn't know about permits or licenses or any of that. I just knew that people in the park were hungry and that I could make good food that they would want to buy, and that the money I earned could help my mom pay for things we needed." The innocent logic of Emma's approach, seeing a need, having a skill to address it, and taking action without understanding the regulatory framework that governed commercial food sales, revealed both her entrepreneurial spirit and her lack of awareness about the complex requirements of legal business operations. Judge Caprio felt his throat tighten as he began to understand the full picture of Emma's situation. Here was a 14-year-old girl who had taken on the responsibility of helping support her disabled mother, who had used her cooking skills to generate income for her family, and who had persisted in her efforts even after being warned that she was violating municipal codes. Whatever had driven Emma to continue her illegal vending despite those warnings must have been extraordinarily compelling. As Emma finished her initial explanation, Judge Caprio could see that she was only beginning to tell the story of how she had ended up operating an illegal food cart. The judge understood that the full picture would require patience and careful questioning to emerge, but he sensed that whatever Emma was about to reveal would be both heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. "Emma, can you tell me more about how you actually started this food vending business?" Judge Caprio asked gently, using the word business rather than illegal operation to acknowledge the entrepreneurial effort Emma had demonstrated. "Where did you learn to cook, and how did you figure out what to sell?" Emma's expression softened noticeably as she prepared to talk about her grandmother, and Judge Caprio could see the love and grief that still accompanied memories of someone who had clearly been very important to her. "My abuela, my grandmother, lived with us until she died 3 years ago," Emma began, her voice taking on the warm tone people use when remembering beloved family members. "She was from Puerto Rico, and she knew how to make all these amazing traditional foods: mofongo, alcapurrias, pastelillos, arroz con gandules." The specific dishes that Emma mentioned revealed both her cultural heritage and the particular culinary skills that her grandmother had passed down to her. Judge Caprio understood that these weren't just recipes. They were connections to family history, cultural identity, and memories of someone Emma had loved deeply. "Abuela started teaching me to cook when I was about 9 years old," Emma continued, her narrative revealing how early she had begun developing the skills that would later become crucial to her family's survival. "She would let me help her in the kitchen after school, and she would tell me stories about Puerto Rico while we cooked together. She said that knowing how to make good food was important because it meant you could always take care of yourself and the people you love." The wisdom that Emma's grandmother had imparted, connecting cooking skills to self-sufficiency and care for others, had clearly planted seeds that would later bloom in Emma's response to her family's crisis. Judge Caprio could see that Emma had internalized her grandmother's lessons about the practical and emotional significance of food preparation. "After Abuela died, I kept cooking her recipes because it made me feel close to her," Emma explained, revealing the emotional comfort that cooking had provided during her grief. "My mom loved it when I made Abuela's food because it reminded her of her own childhood. And my cousins and aunt would always ask me to make certain dishes for family gatherings." The validation and appreciation that Emma had received for her cooking had clearly built her confidence in her culinary abilities and created a foundation for believing that her skills might have commercial value. Judge Caprio understood that Emma's food cart wasn't just about making money. It was about honoring her grandmother's legacy and using inherited skills to address contemporary needs. "When my mom got really sick and we started having money problems, I thought about Abuela's words about food being a way to take care of people," Emma said, connecting her grandmother's philosophy to her decision to start vending. "I realized that I had a skill that could help my family, even though I was too young to get a regular job." The logical progression from recognizing a skill to identifying a way to monetize it demonstrated Emma's mature problem-solving abilities. Judge Caprio could see that this 14-year-old had approached her family's financial crisis with the kind of strategic thinking that many adults never develop. "I started by making pastelillos on weekends. They're these fried pastries filled with meat or cheese," Emma explained, describing the beginning of her vending operation. "I would make a big batch early Saturday morning, put them in containers to keep them warm, and take them to Roger Williams Park where there are always lots of people walking around, having picnics, playing sports." The choice of Roger Williams Park as her vending location showed Emma's understanding of where potential customers would be concentrated. Judge Caprio could picture this young teenager setting up her informal operation in the park, hoping to earn money to help her struggling family. "At first, I just had a small cooler and I would walk around offering to sell pastelillos to people," Emma continued, describing her humble beginnings. "I charged $3 each, which was less than food trucks charged, but enough that I could make some profit after paying for ingredients. People really liked them, and many customers would come back the next weekend looking for me." The organic growth of Emma's customer base, driven by quality and word of mouth rather than advertising or formal business development, demonstrated that she was providing genuine value to her customers. Judge Caprio understood that Emma's success wasn't based on exploiting people but on offering a good product at a fair price. "After a few weeks, I had regular customers who would specifically seek me out," Emma said with obvious pride in her entrepreneurial success. "Some of them would place orders for the next weekend, like they'd ask me to bring extra alcapurrias or to make certain fillings for the pastelillos. I started keeping a notebook with orders so I wouldn't forget." The sophistication of Emma's operation, taking advance orders, maintaining customer records, planning production based on demand, revealed business acumen that would have impressed any small business owner. Judge Caprio was struck by the contrast between Emma's obvious competence and capability and the illegal status of her operation due to her age and lack of permits. "I was making between $50 and $80 every weekend," Emma explained, revealing the financial impact of her vending. "That might not sound like much to some people, but for my family it was huge. It meant my mom could buy her medications without having to skip doses. It meant we could contribute more to my aunt for groceries. It meant I could buy new shoes when my old ones fell apart instead of asking my mom for money she didn't have." The specific ways that Emma's income had improved her family's circumstances highlighted the practical significance of her efforts. Judge Caprio understood that every dollar Emma earned represented not just financial benefit but reduced stress and improved quality of life for a family that had been struggling with the daily indignities and deprivations of poverty. "After about 2 months of selling in the park, a park ranger came up to me and asked if I had permits for my food cart," Emma said, her narrative reaching the first encounter with authority that would eventually lead to her citations. "I didn't even know what he meant at first. I told him I was just selling food I made at home, and he explained that I needed business licenses and health permits and all these other official documents to sell food to the public." The gap between Emma's innocent entrepreneurship and the complex regulatory requirements of legal food vending revealed a common challenge faced by informal economy participants: the disconnect between practical need and institutional barriers to legitimate business operation. Judge Caprio understood that Emma's ignorance of permit requirements wasn't willful disregard for the law but simple lack of knowledge about regulatory systems. "The ranger was actually pretty nice about it," Emma continued, revealing that the initial enforcement encounter had been educational rather than punitive. "He explained that the rules existed to protect public health and safety, and that I could get in trouble if I kept selling without permits. He told me to look into what I needed to do to operate legally, and he said he wouldn't cite me that day but that he would have to if he saw me selling again without proper documentation." The warning that Emma had received represented exactly the kind of enforcement approach designed to encourage compliance rather than simply impose penalties. Judge Caprio could see that the park ranger had tried to help Emma understand the requirements while giving her an opportunity to come into compliance before facing legal consequences. As Emma described the park ranger's warning, Judge Caprio could sense that the story was approaching a crucial turning point, the moment when Emma had to decide whether to stop her illegal vending or continue despite knowing the consequences. The judge understood that whatever had motivated Emma to persist would reveal the true depth of her family's crisis and the desperate circumstances that had driven this young girl to knowingly break the law. "After the ranger warned me, I went home and tried to research what I would need to operate legally," Emma continued, her words revealing that she had initially tried to comply with the requirements. "I spent hours at the library looking up information about business licenses, health permits, and food handler certifications. The more I learned, the more impossible it seemed." Judge Caprio leaned forward, understanding that Emma was describing the moment when she had confronted the practical barriers that prevented her from transitioning from informal to formal business operation. The gap between wanting to follow the law and being able to afford compliance was a common trap that caught many aspiring entrepreneurs from low-income backgrounds. "The business license alone costs $250 per year," Emma explained, her voice revealing both frustration and resignation. "Then there are health permits, food handler certification classes, requirements about using commercial kitchen space instead of cooking at home, liability insurance. All of it adds up to thousands of dollars that I didn't have and no way to get." The financial barriers to legal operation that Emma described highlighted a cruel irony. The very regulations designed to ensure public safety and legitimate business practices could effectively exclude the people who most needed economic opportunities. Judge Caprio understood that Emma had been caught in an impossible situation where following the law required resources she didn't possess. "I also found out that you have to be at least 18 years old to get most business licenses," Emma added, revealing another insurmountable barrier to legitimate operation. "Even if I could somehow get the money for all the fees and requirements, I couldn't legally operate a food business until I was an adult. But my family needed help now, not 4 years from now." The age restriction that Emma mentioned added another layer of impossibility to her situation. Judge Caprio could see that Emma had been trapped by regulations that, while reasonable in general application, created situations where minors trying to help their families had no legal path to economic contribution beyond traditional employment that wasn't available to them. I talked to my mom about what I had learned, and she told me I had to stop selling food in the park, Emma said, her narrative revealing that her mother had tried to prevent her daughter from continuing illegal activity. Mom said she appreciated that I was trying to help, but that she didn't want me to get in trouble with the law. She said we would find other ways to manage our expenses. The mother's response, prioritizing her daughter's legal safety over financial benefit, demonstrated Maria Rodriguez's values and protective instincts despite her own desperate circumstances. Judge Caprio could see that Emma's mother had tried to shield her daughter from the consequences of illegal economic activity, even when that activity was providing crucial family support. "So I stopped selling for 2 weeks," Emma admitted, revealing that she had initially complied with both the ranger's warning and her mother's directive. "But during those 2 weeks, I watched my mom struggle in ways that broke my heart. She had to skip doses of her medication because she couldn't afford to refill all her prescriptions. She was in pain but trying to hide it from me. I could hear her crying at night when she thought I was asleep." The deterioration in Maria's condition during the 2 weeks when Emma stopped vending provided the context for understanding why Emma had ultimately resumed her illegal activity. Judge Caprio could imagine the anguish of watching a parent suffer while possessing the skills and ability to help but being prohibited by law from using them. "Then something happened that changed everything," Emma said, her voice taking on the intense tone of someone describing a pivotal moment. "My mom's doctor told her about a new treatment for multiple sclerosis. It's not a cure, but it can slow down the progression of the disease and reduce symptoms. The doctor said my mom would be a good candidate for this treatment." The emergence of hope, the possibility that Maria's condition could be improved through medical intervention, added profound significance to Emma's situation. Judge Caprio understood that for a family that had been managing decline and accepting progressive disability, the prospect of actual improvement would have been transformative. "But the treatment is expensive, and our Medicaid doesn't fully cover it," Emma explained, her words revealing the cruel gap between medical possibility and financial reality. "The doctor said that even with insurance covering most of it, my mom would need to pay about $1,200 in co-pays and out-of-pocket costs for the first 3 months of treatment." The specific dollar amount, $1,200, represented an insurmountable sum for a family living on disability benefits of $640 per month. Judge Caprio could see that Emma had been confronted with the devastating knowledge that her mother could potentially improve but would be denied that opportunity because of poverty. "When my mom told me about the treatment and how much it would cost, I could see the hope in her eyes for the first time in years," Emma said, her voice breaking with emotion. "But then I watched that hope turn into resignation as she realized there was no way we could afford it. She said it was okay, that she would manage with her current medications, that we shouldn't worry about treatments we couldn't afford." The mother's attempt to spare her daughter from feeling responsible for her inability to access treatment revealed Maria's continued protective instincts despite her own disappointment. Judge Caprio understood that Maria had been trying to shield Emma from guilt and worry, not realizing that her daughter was already plotting ways to make the impossible treatment financially feasible. "That night, I counted all the money I had saved from my food sales. It was $840 hidden in my room," Emma revealed, her words showing the careful way she had been managing and preserving her earnings. "I realized that if I went back to selling in the park, I could probably make the rest of what Mom needed for her treatment in about 6 or 7 weeks. It would mean breaking the law and risking getting cited, but it also meant giving my mom a chance to get better." The calculation that Emma had made, weighing legal risk against the possibility of her mother's improvement, represented exactly the kind of impossible choice that poverty and inadequate social support systems forced on families. Judge Caprio could see that Emma's decision hadn't been casual or thoughtless, but rather a deliberate acceptance of personal risk in service of her mother's well-being. "I made the decision to go back to selling food in the park, even though I knew I was breaking the law and even though my mom had told me to stop," Emma admitted, her words revealing both her acceptance of responsibility and her willingness to prioritize her mother's health over obedience to authority. I didn't tell my mom I was doing it again. I would leave for the park early on Saturday and Sunday mornings before she woke up, and I'd come home with the money hidden in my backpack. The deception that Emma had practiced, hiding her resumed vending from her mother to prevent Maria from stopping her, added another layer of complexity to the situation. Judge Caprio understood that Emma's lies weren't meant to enable harmful behavior, but rather to protect her ability to help her mother despite Maria's own objections to Emma breaking the law. As Emma described her decision to resume selling despite her mother's objections and the ranger's warnings, Judge Caprio could see the moral complexity of her situation crystallizing. This wasn't a case of a rebellious teenager disregarding authority. It was a desperate daughter willing to accept personal consequences to give her mother a chance at improved health and quality of life. I sold food in the park for 6 more weekends before I got my first official citation, Emma continued, her narrative approaching the moment when her illegal activity had resulted in formal legal consequences. The same ranger who had warned me before saw me and came over. He looked disappointed but not angry. He said he had to cite me this time because I had been given a fair warning and had chosen to ignore it. The ranger's response, disappointment rather than anger, suggested that he had recognized Emma's situation wasn't typical and that he understood, at least partially, the difficult circumstances that had motivated her continued vending. Judge Caprio could imagine the enforcement officer struggling with his obligation to cite a young girl who was clearly trying to help her family. I accepted the citation without arguing, Emma said, revealing her understanding that she had knowingly broken rules and needed to accept the consequences. The ranger asked me why I had kept selling after he warned me, and I told him the truth, that my mom needed medical treatment we couldn't afford and that I was trying to earn enough money to help her get it. He seemed sad about having to cite me, but he said the rules were the rules. The exchange between Emma and the ranger revealed the human face of law enforcement, an officer who sympathized with Emma's circumstances but who was bound by regulations that didn't allow for exceptions based on sympathetic motivations. Judge Caprio understood that the ranger had been caught between his duty to enforce municipal codes and his personal recognition of the desperate circumstances that had motivated Emma's violations. After that first citation, I thought maybe I should stop, Emma admitted, revealing that she had briefly reconsidered her strategy. I showed my mom the citation, and she was upset, not angry at me, but upset that I had been taking risks to try to help her. She told me again that I needed to stop, that she'd rather suffer than have me face legal trouble. The mother's continued prioritization of her daughter's well-being over her own medical needs demonstrated the profound love and protective instinct that Maria felt toward Emma. Judge Caprio could see that Maria would rather accept her progressive disability than allow her daughter to face legal consequences, but he suspected that Emma had not been deterred by her mother's objections. "But I couldn't stop, Your Honor," Emma said, her voice taking on an intensity that commanded complete attention. By that time, I had almost $1,100 saved. I was so close to having enough for my mom's treatment. I thought if I could just sell for 2 or 3 more weekends, I would have enough, and then I could stop and pay whatever fines I had accumulated. The calculus that Emma described, accepting certain legal consequences in exchange for achieving her goal of funding her mother's treatment, revealed sophisticated risk assessment and prioritization. Judge Caprio understood that Emma had essentially decided that fines were worth paying if they came after she had secured the money for her mother's medical care. Over the next 4 weekends, I got 5 more citations from different rangers, Emma explained, revealing the progressive accumulation of violations that had brought her to court. Each time, I told them the same thing, that I knew I was breaking the rules, that I understood I would face consequences, but that I had to keep going because my mom needed help and I was the only one who could provide it. The consistency of Emma's explanation across multiple enforcement encounters demonstrated that she had developed a clear narrative about her motivations and had accepted full responsibility for her choices. Judge Caprio could see that Emma wasn't trying to avoid accountability, but rather to ensure that the authorities understood the desperate circumstances that had driven her continued violations. "The Rangers tried different approaches with me," Emma continued, describing the various enforcement strategies that had been attempted. Some tried to scare me by talking about how serious the penalties could be. Others tried to be sympathetic and suggested that there might be social services or charitable organizations that could help my mom. But none of them could tell me how to get $1,200 quickly enough to help my mom start treatment before her next doctor's appointment. The failure of the system to provide Emma with viable legal alternatives to her illegal vending highlighted the inadequacy of social support structures for families in crisis. Judge Caprio understood that Emma had essentially been telling the Rangers, "Show me another way to get this money in time, and I'll stop." But no one had been able to offer her that alternative. "Last weekend was my final time selling in the park," Emma said, her words suggesting that she had achieved her goal or had been forced to stop. "I had saved exactly $1,237. I went home and put all the money on the kitchen table in front of my mom, and I told her that she was going to get the treatment her doctor recommended." Judge Caprio felt his throat constrict as he imagined the scene Emma was describing. A 14-year-old girl presenting her mother with money earned through weeks of illegal vending, representing countless hours of cooking, selling, and accepting citations in pursuit of one goal, giving her mother hope for improvement. "My mom started crying when she saw all that money," Emma continued, tears now flowing freely down her own cheeks as she remembered the moment. "She asked me where it came from, and I had to tell her the whole truth, that I had been selling food in the park every weekend despite her telling me to stop, that I had received 6 citations with fines totaling $900, but that I didn't care about the fines because she was worth it." The declaration that her mother was worth it, worth the legal risk, worth the fines, worth the possibility of serious consequences, revealed the depth of Emma's love and her willingness to sacrifice her own interests for her mother's well-being. Judge Caprio understood that Emma had essentially decided that giving her mother a chance at improved health was more important than her own clean record or financial security. "My mom was torn between gratitude and guilt," Emma explained, describing her mother's complex emotional response. "She was grateful that I loved her enough to take such risks, but she felt guilty that my love for her had led me to break the law and face legal consequences. She said she couldn't accept the money if it meant I would be in serious trouble." The mother's attempt to refuse the money despite desperately needing it revealed Maria's continued efforts to protect her daughter, even when accepting that protection meant accepting continued suffering. Judge Caprio could see that both mother and daughter were engaged in a mutual contest of self-sacrifice, each trying to bear burdens that should have been prevented by adequate social support systems. "But I convinced her that the money was already earned and the citations were already issued, so refusing the money wouldn't change anything about my legal situation," Emma said, revealing the persuasive logic she had used to overcome her mother's resistance. "I told her that the only thing that would make my law-breaking worthwhile was if she actually used the money for her treatment. If she refused it, then I would have broken the law for nothing." The argument that Emma had presented, that refusing the money would retroactively make her violations meaningless, was sophisticated and effective. Judge Caprio understood that Emma had essentially told her mother, "Honor my sacrifice by accepting its intended benefit." "Your Honor, that's why I'm here today," Emma concluded, her voice steady despite her tears. "I broke the law 6 times over 2 months. I ignored warnings from park rangers who were just trying to do their jobs. I disobeyed my mother's direct instruction to stop selling food. I knew what I was doing was illegal, and I did it anyway because I believed, and I still believe, that my mother's health and possibly her life were worth more than my perfect compliance with municipal vending regulations." Judge Caprio sat in complete, stunned silence for what felt like an eternity after Emma finished speaking. Tears were streaming freely down his face, and he made no attempt to wipe them away or hide the profound emotional impact that Emma's testimony had on him. In 30 years of presiding over municipal court, Judge Caprio had never been more speechless, more humbled, or more aware that he was in the presence of someone whose courage, love, and moral clarity had rendered all his legal training and judicial experience almost irrelevant. The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence, with many observers openly crying as they processed what they had just heard. This wasn't just a case about illegal food vending. It was a testament to the depth of a daughter's love, the inadequacy of social support systems, and the impossible choices that poverty forces on families who are simply trying to survive and care for each other. When Judge Caprio finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion that he could not and would not attempt to control. "Emma," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had been fundamentally changed by what he had heard, "I need you to understand something. In 3 decades as a judge, I have never heard anyone explain their actions with more honesty, more courage, or more moral clarity than you have just demonstrated." Emma looked up at Judge Caprio with surprise, clearly expecting condemnation or at least stern lecture rather than acknowledgment and praise. Her mother squeezed her hand tightly, both women understanding that something extraordinary was happening in this courtroom. "What you did was technically illegal," Judge Caprio continued, his voice growing stronger as he found the words to express what Emma's story meant to him. "You violated municipal vending codes, you ignored official warnings, and you continued operating without permits despite knowing the consequences. Those are facts that I cannot and will not ignore." Emma nodded, her expression showing that she was prepared to accept whatever judgment was coming, that she understood her actions had legal consequences regardless of her motivations. "But," Judge Caprio said, his tone shifting in a way that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward in anticipation, "I also need to acknowledge that what you did was an act of profound love, extraordinary courage, and moral reasoning that puts most adults to shame. You identified a problem, developed a solution, executed that solution with impressive competence, and accepted personal risk in service of someone you love. Those qualities are exactly what we should want to nurture in young people, not punish." Emma's tears began flowing more freely as she heard Judge Caprio articulating a perspective on her actions that went beyond simple legal judgment to recognize the complexity of her situation and the nobility of her motivations. "Emma Rodriguez, these citations are hereby dismissed in their entirety," Judge Caprio announced, his voice ringing with the moral authority of someone making a decision based on profound understanding rather than rigid rule application. "You will not pay 1 penny in fines. Not today, not ever. And anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, but Judge Caprio raised his hand for silence because he wasn't finished. Walking around his desk to stand directly in front of Emma and her mother, he looked at both of them with an expression of deep respect and genuine care. "Furthermore," Judge Caprio continued, "I am going to personally ensure that your family is connected with every resource available to help you. Social services, charitable organizations, medical assistance programs. I will make it my mission to ensure that you never again have to choose between legal compliance and your mother's health care." Maria Rodriguez began sobbing openly, overwhelmed by the compassion and practical support being offered by this judge who had transformed from an intimidating authority figure into an advocate for her family. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Judge Caprio said, addressing Emma's mother directly, "you have raised an extraordinary daughter. The love, responsibility, and moral courage that Emma has demonstrated today are direct reflections of the values you have instilled in her. You should be incredibly proud." But Judge Caprio had one more surprise for the family. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out $300 and pressed it into Emma's hands despite her immediate protests. "This is to replace some of what you spent on those citations before I dismissed them," he said firmly. "And I want you to use it to buy ingredients for your grandmother's recipes, because that cooking skill is a precious legacy that deserves to be honored and preserved." Emma looked down at the money in her hands, then up at Judge Caprio with an expression of disbelief and gratitude. "Your Honor, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You've given us so much more than just dismissing the fines. You've given us hope and dignity and the feeling that someone cares about what happens to us." "Emma," Judge Caprio said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a message he wanted the young girl to remember forever, "I want you to understand something important about what happened here today. You came to this courtroom expecting punishment, but what you deserved was recognition. You broke rules that were designed to serve important purposes, but you did so in service of a higher moral obligation, caring for your mother." The judge paused, making sure Emma was fully absorbing his words. "As you grow older, you'll face many situations where rules and regulations conflict with human needs and moral obligations. What I want you to remember from today is that the letter of the law is important, but the spirit of justice is more important. Rules exist to serve human well-being, not to prevent loving families from taking care of each other. The lesson that Judge Caprio was imparting went far beyond Emma's specific case and touched on fundamental questions about the purpose of legal systems and the role of compassion in administration of justice. Emma was nodding seriously, clearly understanding that she was receiving wisdom that would guide her throughout her life. "I also want you to promise me something," Judge Caprio continued, his voice taking on a tone of gentle authority. "I want you to promise that you'll accept help when it's offered, that you'll allow the community to support your family, and that you'll recognize that needing help isn't weakness, it's part of being human." The permission to accept assistance, the explicit statement that needing and accepting help wasn't shameful, visibly affected both Emma and her mother, who had clearly been struggling with the stigma and pride that often prevents families in crisis from seeking available support. "I promise, Your Honor," Emma said, her voice strong despite her tears. "I promise to accept help, and I also promise that when I'm older and in a better position, I'll help other families the way you're helping us today. I'll pay forward the kindness you've shown us." As Emma and her mother prepared to leave the courtroom that day, supported by court staff who had been mobilized to connect them with social services and assistance programs, Emma turned back one final time to address Judge Caprio. "Your Honor, can I tell you something that my abuela used to say?" Judge Caprio nodded, sensing that Emma wanted to share something significant. "Abuela used to say that the true measure of a society isn't how it treats its most successful people, but how it treats its most vulnerable members," Emma said, her words carrying wisdom passed down through generations. "Today, you showed me what that means. You looked at a poor family with nowhere else to turn, and instead of adding to our burdens, you lifted them. That's something I'll never forget." The wisdom that Emma's grandmother had shared, and that Emma was now reflecting back to Judge Caprio, created a perfect circle of understanding about justice, compassion, and social responsibility. The judge understood that this young girl had taught him as much as he had taught her, that sometimes the people who appear before the bench as defendants are actually teachers, that the law must serve human needs rather than abstract principles, and that true justice always makes room for love, even when love leads people to break rules. Judge Caprio would carry Emma's story with him for the rest of his career, using it to remind himself that behind every violation, every citation, every technical infraction, there exists a human story that deserves to be heard and understood. Emma's courage in breaking the law to help her mother had become a gift to everyone who heard it, a reminder that love sometimes requires us to choose between competing obligations, and that systems designed to protect us should never become barriers that prevent us from caring for the people who matter most. The story of Emma Rodriguez's appearance in Providence Municipal Court would be shared millions of times, inspiring people to look beyond surface judgments to recognize the complex circumstances that shape human behavior. And somewhere in that courtroom recording, preserved for posterity, was the image of a 14-year-old girl standing beside her disabled mother, explaining with perfect moral clarity why she had broken the law, leaving a veteran judge speechless with admiration for her courage, speechless with sorrow for the circumstances that had required such courage, and speechless with hope that her story might inspire others to respond to desperate situations with compassion rather than judgment.